see if this works. I think it does. Welcome everyone for coming here despite of the typical Dutch weather. I think there's some 20 of us, so that's probably a bit less than the Bata colony in Singapore was. My name is Philip Bloem. I'm a historian working at the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam, and previously I worked for the Czech Center with Anna Schenk, who took the initiative to organize this presentation, and I want to thank her, and I want to also thank the colleagues of the Goethe Institute for their hospitality. We will be hearing tonight from Jan Beranek, who wrote a very fascinating book about his great uncle, Silvestr Němec, who as a young man vanished in 1942 in Singapore. And Jan will tell us about the book. There will be a room for questions and discussion afterwards, and I will start by sharing some impressions the book made on me. I thought it was, from the first page, a fascinating read, and I was very impressed that Jan, who started to research the fate of his grand uncle, first with a blog that he did this all on the side in his spare time, because Jan works at Greenpeace International. He's not a writer or historian who gets the whole day doing this research. And I was also struck by the Asian dimension. When you pick up a book about a Czech boy from a Moravian village in the Second World War, you don't expect to end up in Singapore. And I saw all kinds of parallels with the stream of books that has appeared in the Netherlands about the war in the colonies, in the Dutch Indies, also about the connections between, for instance, people from the resistance in the Netherlands. Quite some of them had roots in the colonies. Czechoslovakia, of course, didn't have colonial empire, but it had something better. It had the Bata Shoe Company, which provided a window into the world and the opportunity for young men like your grand uncle to end up in places like Singapore. And another thing I very much enjoyed, that when you buy this book, it's actually two stories for the price of one. You have the story of Silvestr Němec, but you also have Jan's story of doing the research and contacting historians and traveling around the world in search of the tiniest traces of his grand uncle. And it raises, I think, all kinds of interesting questions about the art of writing history. We are now at an age where the last witnesses of who were actively involved in the Second World War, they are slowly but steadily dying out. Just 2 weeks ago in the Netherlands, the last Dutch participant of D-Day passed away. Earlier this year, the last pilot who participated in the Battle of Britain died. And when you are trained when you study history, as I did at the university, you are trained to be very suspicious of oral testimonies, and you are trained to focus on archives. And here it would, of course, also have been great to talk to people who might have known Silvestr, or who witnessed the events in Singapore. So perhaps later on we can talk a little bit more about that dilemma in the writing of history. And a last thing that really struck me was that Jan is not trying to paper over the lacks, the gaps in his research. like I said, I work at the Besitzungsmuseum. We have a big archive with hundreds, perhaps even thousands of documents about the war, personal stories, and many books that are published. They try to present this complete, perfect picture. And when you work in an archive, you know that often these stories are incomplete, that a lot of what you want to know is simply not there anymore, not in the documents. And in this book, I think you do not try to paper it over, but you sort of embrace these gaps and you devise different scenarios of what could have happened with Silvestr, on what sources it's based, what is more likely than not. And I found that a very inspiring way of retelling this story. Well, so far from me, and now Jan will introduce us to his book.
Thank you, Philip, so much for such lovely words. I will actually stand up and show a couple of slides while I'll be presenting some parts of my work and the book and the stories, and then it will be about half an hour, and then we plan to have conversation and exchange with any of you who are interested. So thank you again. Thank you again. Does it work? Maybe it does not. I will speak loud anyway. I think this is a room I can manage to be understandable in.
Yeah, I think this is working. It's working.
It's working?
No, I mean we can hear you.
Yeah. It's working.
So, probably me. Another try? No. Anyway, so thank you again. I would like to thank Philip and Hanna Schenk, who have organized it from the New Czech Culture in Netherlands, and Claudia from the Goethe Institute. It's very lovely. And above all, I would like to thank actually all of you to come tonight and to become part of the journey, because what I've been experiencing for the last 8 years has been this journey of discovery and learning things, and building new connections, and actually creating also friendships all around the world with people I would otherwise never get in touch with. And that's very precious, and tonight is another milestone on the journey that still continues. Actually, I didn't finish by publishing the book. I continue the search. There is some other things that may be happening or I intend to do to remember Silvestr, my great uncle, and the Czechoslovak community, so stay tuned, and thank you for that. So, as I've said, I started 8 years ago. I came across a bunch, maybe a dozen of documents in the family archives, which included 4 photographs of the great uncle and some letters, mostly actually post-war correspondence of his family with authorities in like the British colonial authorities in Singapore, and the headquarters of Bata in Zlín, and other places where they were searching to get to know about what happened to Silvestr, their youngest son. And that search continued actually for 2 years after the war, until in the middle of 1947 the family finally received a certificate for death, because even after the war ended, Silvestr didn't surface, and then he was pronounced as missing and eventually officially declared dead. But nobody really knew what happened to him, what exactly were the circumstances, and there was a big mystery that has been unresolved for decades. Even more so because Czechoslovakia became part of the Eastern Soviet bloc, and the communication means with the West or Singapore basically have been severed. And also the family, parents living in the Czech countryside have been not having the language skills or other possibilities. So I decided to discover more. I found the story very interesting because, as Philip mentioned, it's not usual that a boy from the Moravian or Czechoslovak countryside ends up in Singapore and then, gets lost in the war. So I've started my search. There is a couple of things I was coming across, which is basically the whole presence of Czechoslovaks in Singapore. which started with some early explorers coming from the Czech lands or Moravian lands when it was still the Austrian Empire. But it was not until 1918 that actually Czechoslovakia was created as a modern state. Before that, there was nothing like Czechoslovakia. There were, the different lands. But Czechoslovakia as entity and Czechoslovaks as citizens only emerged after the First World War. And very interestingly, that's actually very shortly after that when they created a quite massive footprint in Singapore, as I discovered also in the local newspapers, because there have been Czechoslovak legions. It's not a very famous part of the World War I, I think, but for us Czechoslovaks it's quite important. When there was about 70,000 of people.
100,000.
Pardon?
100.
Okay, I know 70,000, maybe 100,000 of patriots who actually got stranded in Russia after the Soviet Revolution, and then they set themselves on a very adventurous journey actually across the whole Siberia using the Trans-Siberian Railway to fight the Bolsheviks and fight their way back to the country, and then ended up in Vladivostok on the far east, from where they were transferred by ships. Basically, about half of them went through Singapore, along basically India and the Suez Canal to Europe, and the other half was traveling through US, basically going to US and then taking the railway and then going on the ships from the eastern coast. So there is actually a number of articles that I found surprisingly that they've left there playing some soccer matches with British officers. They performed several concerts because there was musicians coming with the soldiers, and there was the first time that actually the Singaporeans and the world, in that part of the world, heard about Czechoslovaks. There was funny newspaper articles, even two of them, that kind of made fun. Who is the Czechoslovaks? Czech or what? Everybody knew what that means. So that was interesting part of discovery. And the reason I am actually talking about this old history of Czechoslovaks is that as I was going through all the archives, I found a very interesting story that I don't want to be forgotten before coming to the Second World War and my great uncle and Bata man, which is of one of these soldiers who ended up in Vladivostok, but he decided he actually somehow came to like the Asian culture and he decided never to come back home. So he spent 1930s, 1920s in China, and he actually is an author of the Sun Yat-sen mausoleum statue in Nanking, and he was also the author of the only death mask of the Chinese national leader, which I find super interesting. And again, I think nobody heard of the Bohuslav Kočí, but that's one of the stories I came across. And there was even a long article about him in the Singaporean newspapers from 1930s when he moved and he was working as sculptor and artist. And he actually is amongst the 10 people, 10 Czechoslovaks who lost lives during the Japanese invasion, because he was one of the evacuation ships that was sunk by Japanese and he died there. Anyway, before we go to that time, there is also, of course, I was searching, the first trace of Bata in the local newspapers, and these are the first marks, 1926, the first advertisement. A big milestone has been 1931, when Bata opened a flagship store in the center of Singapore, in the Capitol building. And shortly after that, in January 1932, Tomáš Bata, the owner and the founder of the company, actually paid a visit to Singapore during a famous trip he took by airplane, actually flying all the way from Europe to British India, and then from there he continued to Malaysia and even to the Dutch Indies. So a little bit of history of the Bata. The logo has been changing over time, and it's very few people know, and actually everybody I came across always thought, this was a local company in India. My Indian colleagues and friends think this is, definitely 100% Indian company and brand. People in Singapore think the same. For them it's very iconic. Everybody said, there was this famous slogan, first to Bata, then to school. They grew up with it, and they always consider the company to be, Singaporean or even Indonesian, wherever. So it's actually a great success of absolute localization of the global brand. that happened, and it's one of the successes, I think, in my view, of the founder. I will first pass a little bit. I mean, the company was really struggling at the beginning. It was founded by Tomáš and two of his siblings, and then he was left alone, and the company went bankrupt a couple of times, almost. He almost managed it. And one of the first famous things that came after the First World War was, there was the economic depression. Everything was super expensive. People weren't able to afford it. And he came with this revolutionary idea to actually crash the costliness, as they called it. It's a slogan that is quite famous in Czech Republic, Bata Shoe Co, where he decided to cut the costs of these shoes by 50%, and he was basically managing it by decreasing the salaries of the workers, but compensating it by, in-kind services. So he was providing the housing, the schooling, the education, hospitals, everything was provided by the company, and therefore the people, were comfortable to live with less salaries. And that's the way how he managed to get out of that situation in which many companies disappeared. And then the second big crisis that actually also helped him, to revolutionize the whole business came with the Great Economic Depression, when suddenly all the countries were building, the tariffs. Today it's happening as well somewhere. And they were protecting, the domestic production. And at that time, Bata was actually having a massive production, but it was all in factories in Czechoslovakia, and he was just exporting it. But so he figured out that actually for him the way to go around these tariffs was to export the whole production line. So he basically established dozens of factories in many countries, basically on 5 continents, to overcome and kind of localize the production. And that's why also, since 1930s, everybody think it's local, because the factories and everything was organized within the region. So it was basically for him opportunity to again grow the business. He was super visionary person. He started with shoes, but at the end he was working, and his companies covered aviation. Even he was building airplanes that were quite successful. Film industries. There was film studios in Zlín. It was all sorts of all-round company, which was quite fascinating, and it's one of the, I think, iconic successes, at least for Czech people, Czechoslovak people, until these days. Unfortunately, being visionary, he preferred to fly, and one day he crashed with his pilot and lost his life. That was actually very shortly after his visit, 6 months after he visited Singapore. But again, the company managed to survive the crisis. The management was taken over by his half-brother, and there was already a capable group of directors who basically continued to manage the ongoing business and to build on it and expand even further. So the 1930s have been like the golden era of the company, when they really expanded globally all around the world. Couple of things about the management, which has been also very unique and part of the success, that I would like to mention, since it's linked to the story of my great uncle as well, is that he was very kind of scientific modern man. He wanted, the innovation and the most recent scientific discoveries to be applied immediately in production, in management, in sales, everywhere. And he established this kind of company that was really driven by performance. I think it was quite hard actually, but there was the weekly norms. Everybody actually had kind of a share in the loss or profit. And if you didn't meet the targets, then basically after a couple of weeks you would probably lose the job, because there was other people coming and waiting to get your spot. So it was very competitive on one hand, but on the other, as I've said, he was also very caring about the staff. So he has been building the whole cities. Actually, this is an example of the Bata city in Zlín for his workers, that was providing them with, at that time, super modern and high standard of living. And again, there was the sports facilities, the hospitals, the shops, everything was basically provided for the workers at very low cost. And it was very attractive, especially for people from the poor countryside and the mountains that surround Zlín. So he always had, many people to choose from, and he was picking the best talents. There was very special, detailed HR system, to assist the candidates and pick the best talents, and then grow them in the company as well. So it was interesting. Very surprising thing for me has been to learn that, he was like in some ways, the archetype of a capitalist. But at the same time, he was very progressive, and he actually was organizing the International Labor Day, or the kind of, the big festivals on the 1st of May for his workers. This is a photo of them, it's called the Labor Day, and I think in some ways it was genuine, in some ways it was possibly also tactical, to just take the wind away from the communist propaganda, because he was providing and doing things that communists were wanting, and he was taking the wind from them. And I find it, especially from today's perspective, it's not very popular comparison, and I know some people are allergic to it, because as I've said, especially for the generation of my parents and grandparents, it's a symbol of, the successful capitalist who was basically destroyed by the communists that took over after the war. But actually, there are some characteristics that are very similar between, the communist methods and approaches to what Bata was applying. So on the ideal side, they had all the vision of the better society. Bata's credo was, I want to better the men, get every chance to lift themselves out of poverty and have, good quality of life. They were emphasizing the well-being of workers. They were very scientific, so religion was not really a thing. They were very much diligent on the central planning, so there were, these weekly and monthly and annual and 3-year and 5-year plans that were, designed to the latest detail. Very strong social control applied also amongst the workers. There was even, people were controlled even in their private lives. They, left the factory, but that doesn't mean that they were off the hook. So they were expected, and it was controlled, that they kind of live the right life. They don't drink, they don't hang out in the nights. They attend, these sports events, and they go to libraries and cinemas, and they try to grow themselves even in their free time. And there was even a commission led by one of the people from Bata's family that was actually randomly visiting the households, and they were checking, if there is enough cleanliness and tidiness in the households, and whether there is a harmonic relation between the husband and wife. And if they were not, they're getting the black points, and if they accumulated enough black points, they were out. So it was very tough, and there was little privacy or kind of real space for freedom, if you want, which I would not stand well. But it was what it was. There was also this cult of the leader, so they were all kind of officially equalistic. They were called, themselves co-workers. So there was a term co-worker, was the official term for everybody on the hierarchy, from the last worker in the factory up to the director. They were all co-workers, but the boss was still the chief. Mr. Chief was how they were addressing him. And I found the last quote actually super fascinating. I was doing the research. Actually, they were very aware of this kind of competition with the communist propaganda and the worldview. And then Jan Antonín Baťa even said that Zlín is more than Moscow. It will remain a model for Moscow to follow. So imagine how the communists must have been hating him. And of course, after the war, when they took over, it led to absolute destruction of the whole system in wherever the communists were under control. The Bata exists today, which is thanks to that actually the son of Tomáš Baťa, he emigrated and he established the modern company, post-war company at Ottawa in Canada, and that's from where it was managed in the Western world, whilst in the communist world it was renamed and really dismantled. Anyway, what's the time? As I've mentioned, that's actually part of the important approaches, which is that, that's what Bata applied during the Great Economic Depression, was to transfer all the production units. And that's a system that actually he accelerated in late 1930s as the war was, looming in Europe. And it was clear that, there is a big risk for Czechoslovakia territory, to be taken by someone else. So he actually organized a massive transfer of workers and the whole production lines overseas. And that included about 1,000 of people who have been basically transported as kind of core teams. Usually it was between 20 and 30 workers, and they together had all the combined skills to be able to start up production, do the sales, and basically everything as kind of seed pockets. And one of them was sent to Singapore, and that's where also my great uncle was part of that transfer. He was apparently chosen as one of the talents, young people who can be sent abroad, and he traveled there on the first, or actually the last day of 1938 is the day was his voyage started from Zlín. I will pass this. Some early explorers, as I said, Bata was present in Singapore since 1931 when he opened the flagship store, and I got connected to some of the descendants of the people who actually were really the first pioneers. So it's part of the family album of Josef Kramoliš. That's the shop. You can see the Capitol building, very famous one, and on the left bottom there is the big brand, the big sign of Bata. And then in 1940 he built his own building just about 100 yards from there that has been using and was there during the war. He was expanding, there was not just the sales, as I've said, so basically he had opened a big shoe production factory in 1936 in British Malaya, in Johor. In 1939, another factory in Singapore itself, and then in 1934 he also purchased a rubber plantation so that he can have his own supplies of raw material to make it cheaper and under control. There's lots of photos, pre-war photos. This one is interesting, you wouldn't know, but this is actually Johor Sultan Ibrahim. He was one of the celebrities of the late 1930s in Singapore, and he was a regular customer of Bata Shoes. This is a picture with the management, but I also read in the diaries actually of Silvestr's friends and colleagues that he sometimes came to the shop, and the young Czech people were asking him whether he will give them the permission to go and visit the waterfalls in the Kota Tinggi, in his reservation in south of Johor, and they know that he always kindly agreed. So there was this relation. This is the very same shop actually where my great uncle worked, the Capitol building one, including the chiropody department on the very left, where he was also working because he was trained as a seller and chiropodist. Lots of more newspaper articles. It's interesting because, again, as I've said, yeah. What is this? There is premises. This is actually the milestone that is also very important. In June 1940, because the war was already in Europe and the Nazis took over Czechoslovakia, including Zlín, the Bata Company was actually put on a blacklist by the Allies because it was based on the territory of the Germans, and basically any trade with Bata could have been seen as trading with enemy. So there was a tough control, and they got supervisory structure above them in Singapore, and it was one of the difficult moments probably. But it was not the first time. There will be more situations when actually the Czechoslovaks and especially the Bata, they found themselves somehow stranded in the two different worlds. And it happened later as well when Japanese came and interned many of the people. They were not sure, are the Czechoslovaks, ally or are the enemy, because they are the subjects of the Germans, but at the same time they are, working and fighting here with the Brits. So that's very special position, which I can come to in detail later. There was some crime reports as well into Bata, big mystery, lots of rubber was stolen. And that's how the journey went for basically all of the Bata men. I've got even the shipping tickets. They were traveling with the second class, and this was the journey they were taking from basically Italy, mostly from Venice, along the Asian coast down to Singapore. There was definitely a big contrast for the boy from the Moravian countryside. This is Silvestr's photo from the school. This is his house, and this is actually in front of his house, a moment when this machine came and they paved the road in the village, so it was a big moment. And Silvestr is the boy on the very right in a hat. So it was part of that exciting things happening at home. And at the time, surely nobody knew about Singapore. Some photos actually of the authentic Czech Bata employees as they transitioned from the ships. I get the first letter, and the only letter actually that has been preserved of Silvestr after he arrived in Singapore. And it was quite funny how he references, many of the exotic things to his things, he's familiar with. So like it was, all the island was the orchard, and the Chinese women were in the pajamas, and Indians, the Sikhs had the bed towels wrapped around their heads. And then there's a note about Chinese kitchens that, he says, it's very strange, there are all these streets filled with Chinese kitchens and where people go and eat, but it's not like at our place, that women cook. Here actually it's all men who are cooking in these kitchens. And he was complaining about the noisy clogs of wooden, and that, the people spit on the ground, and it was like really, I can only imagine, and there is a lot of space for imagination, how we have perceived all the things. There is plenty of, again, newspapers, including photos. I think Silvestr is probably one of the people of the photo, but it's not possible to recognize him. Because amongst other things, they were organizing these annual gatherings in the center of Singapore to remember the anniversary of Czechoslovakia as a free independent state, which by then actually wasn't existing anymore, in a colonial regime where actually many others were fighting for independence and didn't get it from the British, and yet there was this group of Czechoslovaks celebrating their lost independence. So again, I think it's very interesting to think how it played out in the environment. As I've said, Bata was also keen to support and endorse people to do sports, so we established this very funny soccer teams, especially the Moravians is the team which refers to Moravia, which is the region from which Silvestr and Zlín and Bata came from. So they were called the Moravians, playing soccer in second league in Singapore. Moravians won sometimes. There is a couple of articles, 3 articles actually, where Silvestr's name even appears. One is that he attended a wedding celebration of one of his colleagues. He was donating to one of the charities during the war, and then he was attending the funeral of the boss of the director of Bata, who died in July 1940. I also came across, the difficulties because, as I mentioned, it was not just Silvestr. At the end, there was about 125 Czechoslovaks who lived in Singapore of very different backgrounds, ways of lives, even nationalities, because Czechoslovakia was a multinational state, so there were also Germans amongst them who declared loyalty to the Nazi Germany, and they got the German passports. There were Jews, there were all sorts of very diverse group of people, and inevitably it also created lots of tensions and animosities, and that was one of the darker sides of the story, is that I discovered actually documentation about lots of less nice things that they were doing to each other, and even the Czechoslovak government in exile in London had to deal with it at some point, so it's documented, but it must have been embarrassing as well. Another thing I found interesting was how they referred to the colonial and segregation society around them, because for the Czechoslovaks it was not usual, to have people of different classes. It was a multinational state which had its problems, but it was definitely not racist in the way of having different categories. So they were wondering about big discrepancies in salaries. There was this quote that there is a big swimming pool that is only for the whites, and that the Chinese built themselves a beautiful swimming pool as a revenge to the whites. And then when they entered the British forces as volunteers, they also were coming across lots of racism there. So they recall how the British were calling them bloody foreigners, in the army, and that they even made this joke that there is this saying, Englishmen will fight to the last man, but they were saying that they will fight to the last foreigner, which unfortunately is pretty much what happened. There was the looming war. I will try to go fast. So there has been lots of charities. The Czechoslovaks organized themselves. Again, there is a nice documentation in the media. The badge, the national dresses on one of the beneficial events. One of them is Czech on the right. Contribution. conditions will pass. And then at the end, as I've said, most of the Czechoslovak men from the Bata, they entered the volunteer groups. Many of them, especially the older people with families, they entered only the kind of lower grade, home defense type of volunteer groups, but the young boys, they joined the serious army and they really became integrated into the armed forces to fight. So there is about 15 of them that I managed to compile from various sources that have been part of that, including Silvestr. They had these trainings. I will pass. The interesting thing is that most of them were with infantry, but Silvestr, again, probably had some special talents or skills, or he was just lucky, but he was assigned to a very rare position of, being with the armored cars, which they were joking, it's kind of the gun machinery deluxe or ovens, because it must have been also horrible. They describe it actually in some of the internal documents, how if you get in this closed car, which is made of iron with no windows, and then you spend 2 hours on the sun in the tropical island, you really melt down, and it was very hard. But they definitely had fun as well. I was reading memoirs how they, after the trainings, gathered in the canteen, and they were playing dice games and drinking whiskey and eating biscuits with sardines and Tabasco on it. So a little bit of details, and I can imagine how Silvestr lived and what he enjoyed. Anyway, the war came, Singapore was attacked, and actually Bata factories have been bombed as well. So this is how they ended up on the documentation. The factory in Klang was eventually even burned down as a part of the scorched earth policy by the British themselves, and as they were retreating. And interesting thing is that it's actually something I really discovered and documented in detail, that actually 12 of the Czechoslovak volunteers participated in the very strong fightings in the Pasir Panjang, which is on the southeast part of the island. And that's where Silvestr has basically kind of disappeared. There is a record that he was injured on the 11th of February, 4 days before the fall of Singapore. He was probably taken to the Alexandra Hospital, which is in the vicinity. And there was very infamous massacre that happened 2 days later when the Japanese soldiers rampaged through the hospital and murdered about 350 people, mostly patients and staff. And he may be amongst the victims. He might have been as well, you never know. There is no hard evidence, and in that sense it's still open story. He might have been one of the people on the evacuation ships, because there was a lot of chaos and people were just boarding the ships in the kind of last hope to escape. And there were these 6 people who lost life, Czechoslovaks, including Bohuslav Koči, who I mentioned, the sculptor of Němec. Some of them were taken as prisoners of war, actually 4 of them, and 3 of them lost lives during the imprisonment in the very hard conditions of the working camps in the jungle, and only 1 survived. But of course it's still possible that Silvestr was also taken as prisoner of war and might have died in early days before the registrations were finished. And this is one of the most remarkable, I'm getting to an end, but one of the things I really enjoyed was, to get to the source and get the original documents in my hands and really, get to the bottom of things. And this is like one of the super fascinating documents. This is a sheet of toilet paper of the brand of JS, and there is 10 sheets that have been preserved, and one of the prisoners was having photographic memory or some super skill, and he was in this miniature writing, documenting, the whereabouts about all the people who he knew, and it has been preserved and it still exists today. And Silvestr Němec, you can see it says Němec, Czech, Bata, POV, prisoner of war. So that's actually one of the signs that he might have been taken as a prisoner of war rather than just killed in the hospital directly. But that's one of the things that Philip mentioned, there is contradicting information. There is all these gaps. So it's just one of the hypotheses or one of the possibilities. There is a couple of clues, but there is no ultimate evidence. So the most likely scenario, as I've said, is that he was one of the victims of the massacre in the hospital. And many of the places, actually, I was surprised, still stand today. So I was standing on the very spot on the corridor where the massacre happened when I visited Singapore. Anyway, so as I've said, there have been 10 Czechoslovaks who actually lost their life in the war. And I just want to take a minute of silence, if you don't mind, to remember them. Thank you so much. So that's the end of my presentation. And if you don't mind, feel free to come again. And we can sit and have conversation.
Yes, thank you, Jan. And before I give the audience the opportunity for questions, you mentioned right at the start that this is an ongoing project, that you are still open to finding new information. Since you published the book, has anything new been presented to you, or are you still following leads in certain directions?
I mean, I'm not searching so intensively, but it happens because now, the book is out, the blog has been out, some publicity, so sometimes, people write me some tips or documents. And it happens that, I get a new information or new little piece of things every month or two. So that's still growing to fill, some of the missing gaps. There was no groundbreaking discovery since I published the book, but these things are happening, and it's, as I've said, some of the nice things that, has its own life and continues.
And is there some particular archive or document, is there something that you are hoping for, that for instance in the Netherlands now this year the archives of the post-war trials were made accessible, at least more accessible than before, and there's huge interest of many people who try to find out more about their family history. Is there some kind of archive like that in anywhere in Japan, in Singapore, where you think, well, if that opens up, then maybe, just maybe, I will find out more?
I don't think there is more information in Singapore, because then during the Japanese reign, nothing really survived. But there has been, it's actually one of the stories that are kind of famous amongst the historians who deal with Singapore and the war, is that there has been 2 huge boxes of documents. It's called so-called Nelson's box by Captain Nelson, who was running kind of semi-legal documentation of the prisoners of war in the central camp in Singapore. And he made all these, names, indexes, and lists and documentation that basically has been obviously shipped to UK, but only a small fraction of it has been opened for public. So it's probably still sitting somewhere in the dungeons, I don't know where, but there might be things that I wasn't able to come across because they were just out of reach. But one of the recent things that gave me kind of hope, or I was excited about rather than actually have hope, I was skeptical. But the Alexandra Hospital in Singapore organized about 3 years ago an archaeological survey on its grounds actually to locate some of the mass graves. And there was, a possibility that they might discover the graves and maybe even identify some of the remains, but it didn't happen. But who knows, that one day
nothing turned up?
No, they didn't find actually the graves, despite some efforts.
Okay, so it's still open if anything new will be discovered. Is there anyone who would like to ask Jan a question about his book? We have, yes, in the back.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I was wondering I haven't read your book, but sorry, but I was wondering if when you were doing the research in the Czechoslovak Republic, the First Republic, when you were saying that Bata, he was also in charge of housing, education, culture, etc. Those are like things that we mostly expect the state or the government to take control of. What was the contemporary reaction if you come across like political in the First Republic to this company now from Zlín providing education, culture, and all of these things that we now consider to like be sort of more controlled by the government?
I mean, I don't think that the politicians had a problem with it. I think, for a long time, but had a very good profile or kind of name also in the political circles. Actually, because he had, the factories centered in Zlín, he decided actually to control the city. And again, from today's perspective, it could be maybe going too far, but he basically got himself elected as a mayor, and then being the mayor and controlling the city, he was able to do all the development, and all the infrastructure was basically in his control. And the motivation was that he was actually, especially for the education, because he was introducing in this kind of very modern ways of producing shoes. Basically he visited Detroit and he was very inspired by Henry Ford, by these mass lines of production. And in Zlín, historically, there were just the cobblers who were making shoes by hands, and they were the kind of old dogs who don't learn new tricks. So it was a conscious decision for him to actually open the schools, attract the young people, and actually teach them and introduce them to the production from very early age. And they were given, the accommodation. It was kind of combined system of the schooling, and then they also started to work in the factories from young age, and he was shaping them basically to fit the company culture and company structures.
Yeah, perhaps it's not only a thing of the past. If you look at big tech companies like Google or Apple, you also see that they provide food for their employees for the whole day, schools for the children, kindergarten. So it doesn't go as far as I think as that they will be visiting the homes, but
they have the robots now for it, right? The artificial intelligence.
They're already there. Yes, they don't need it anymore. Yeah. Any other? Yes, first in the back and then. Yes, I'm. Yes.
My question is, how long did Thomas Bata expected to work? Because the transfer company or part of the company from Europe to Asia is a big deal. And from the occupation of Austria to Munich was just a couple of months, and it was just 1 year to occupation of Czechoslovakia. Did he expected the war, Tomáš Bata, before 1938?
I think he knew that disruptions would come, and I'm not sure if he was able to predict the war or the exact scenario as it unfolded, but he definitely really boosted all these transfers at the end of 1937 and 1938 and first half of 1939 actually were like 80% of the 1,000 people I mentioned who were transferred abroad, went out. So I think he was trying to speed it up as much as he could. And then, of course, when the Germans came and to occupy the Czech Republic and Zlín in March 1939, it was difficult. Yeah.
He was busy with transfer of part of the company to Asia before 1938. Are you saying this?
At a smaller scale, yes. So, as I've said, the factory for the shoes in Malaysia was opened in 1936. So, yes, some of that was happening throughout 1930s. But since 1937, the end of the year, it really scaled up several times in a much bigger level. That's why, for example, the shoe factory in Singapore was opened in 1939, and it was literally they dismantled one building in Zlín and put it on ship, and everything went just to be reassembled in Singapore.
Thank you for the answer.
Okay, I saw one question.
Thank you. Yeah, super interesting story. And I'm curious if you could tell a bit more about the family situation of your great uncle when you left to Singapore and maybe, I don't know if he also built a life there.
Yes, I mean, he left basically for Singapore when he was 19 years old, so at a very young age, and he died at less than 22. So I documented, there is the whole chapter in the book about the childhood in the village, which is kind of close to my heart as well. I spent a lot of my childhood time there with my grandma and grandfather on the farm. So I connected quite nicely to it. But he really left, as a very young. He was the youngest child of the family, and the younger brother actually of my grandmother. And how he lived in Singapore, besides the one letter and few more traces, we can really speculate. I saw, the 3 press clippings, so I know he was at the wedding and the funeral. He was with the volunteers. That helped a lot because, I've discovered a lot of details about how the volunteers trained and that they met, every Thursday at 5:15 p.m., for the regular trainings and, lots of things where I can put him into, but there is no direct voice how he have experienced it. So I need to extrapolate, and that's actually quite possible, from, the diaries or letters of his friends or colleagues. So there is wealth of information from other people who have been kind of living the same life and being in the same community as he was. And I can just, as I say, extrapolate. So I can imagine he was going to these waterfalls of the Sultan Ibrahim and what other things they were doing together based on memoirs of the others. But when it comes to him, the last voice basically that came from him was the letter just after arrival to the island. And then I also know that's interesting, one of the documents is the inventory of his belongings that was compiled by his friend who lived with him before the war, and he basically gave it to the family in 1946 when they were trying to kind of get some compensations. So I know the address, and the building still is there, so I was actually standing on the doorstep of the very same apartment where he spent last few months of his life. That was touching. But interesting item, the only one, otherwise there is clothings and small piece of furniture. It's actually a camera, so I know that he was also into photography like I am. And it's one of the connections, but again, it's like more hypothetical than real. I really don't know. I haven't seen any of his photos, nothing was preserved. But there is lots of these things you can just, put him into the bigger picture of things as they surface when you read the witnesses on the memoirs of the others.
Yes. I hope this is not too uncomfortable question, but you talked about the tensions and frictions among the Czechoslovaks. Could you please elaborate on what it was like?
Yes, I can. It's okay. I mean, I felt uncomfortable when I was discovering it, especially because it didn't put some of the Bata management into really good light. And through my work and networking, I got connected to the descendants of the Bata families, and for them it was almost sacrosanct thing. And then I was thinking how to package it and how to actually publish these things, because it's not comfortable, especially for some of the people I know. But it went okay. I mean, there have been 2 big things that I came across which are really very well documented. One is more personal, and that's the director of Václav Freud, was one of the photos, who died actually of the heart attack in July 1940, where Silvestr went to his funeral. That he was having really problems with his behaviors, and he was sexually assaulting some of the wives of the Bata men, and there have been complaints going even to Zlín. And interestingly, actually, it's something I quote even in the book from that I found in the headquarters of Zlín. A letter, or not a letter, kind of a decision taken by Antonín Bata, the director of the company, that says, Václav Freud is doing all these things, and he has been, one of the longest serving persons and, very loyal to the company. But we cannot tolerate this because, woman is a sacrosanct, element in the families of the Bata people, and, he cannot behave like this, and unless it changes, we will have to fire him. So that was actually nice to see that they didn't somehow put it under the carpet, and they were trying to deal with it in Zlín, and perhaps it came to its end when he deceased. So there was one thing, and again there is testimonies and letters, quite interesting. And then the other was more this structural things in the community. So there have been these 120 people. Most of them, actually, the majority was the Bata employees and the families, but there were also other people working for Skoda, for example, and other brands. There were artists and adventurers and these Germans. And there was a split and big discussion about creation of Czechoslovak society, like to organize themselves. And they divided themselves into two camps. One were the Bata people, led by this director, and the others were, all the others, including some of the Bata employees who were unhappy with the director, who also became secret members of the other association, as I learned, including Silvestr. So he was actually one of these people who really took it uneasily, with management. And he eventually was probably fired because that person was firing everybody who disagreed with him. That was one of the other traits. So there is several indications that he actually lost the job, and then in the last few months he lived in this apartment together with his friend. Anyway, so there was this animosity, and then they basically weren't able to agree on the statutes of the association and who will be the leader. So they created two of them, and they were just tarnishing each other, even publicly, sending complaints to the British authorities and sending complaints to London, to the Czechoslovak government, and it was nasty. But again, it's hard to judge, especially retrospectively, and I can imagine, especially for people who are really young and experienced, coming to this tropic environment, and then the war came, and there was all these tensions between the nationalities and political positioning that maybe it was inevitable. And interestingly, I've read about similar tensions in Czechoslovak communities, also in Cape Town and in one of the Chinese towns. It was Shanghai, I think. But actually there was similar things happening within the small group of Czechoslovaks, which I found embarrassing. But that's, again, the dark fact that I don't want to hide, and I was trying to describe things, as I was really discovering them as objectively as possible, even if it was unpleasant or not so easy to deal with.
Yeah, it's probably not uncommon for exile communities, small exile communities, to have these kind of that live isolated to a certain extent, to experience these kind of tensions.
Yeah.
In the first row.
Yeah, I have a question more on the personal aspect of this, because you have a full-time job and that's already a lot. So what brought you to this long-term path? What was the first spark that made you go through this research, and what makes you keep on going on that?
I mean, it came actually when I suddenly, as I work for Greenpeace, as you know, and I was working as a director in Greenpeace Mediterranean. So I was based in Istanbul for a few years, but my family wasn't able to relocate there, so I was having part-time there, part-time home, and then I had the spare kind of time in the evenings. And coincidentally, at the time, the Czechoslovak archives published digitized, kind of records, the birth and death and marriage records, registers, basically, for a couple of centuries back. So I took a look, and I am really fascinated by the original documents, how they look. So I was reading on it, and then I started to look for my ancestors, and then started to build a little bit of family tree. And then my mom, she knew I was interested, so she gave me this box with the family documents, which was a lot, which was about Silvestr. Figure out more, find out more what happened. And that was the beginning of the journey, and again was some evenings and weekends. And I really find it, I've learned a lot, because for me, also growing up, in the communist Czechoslovakian schooling, of course I knew about the war, about the Red Army was the narrative, but I knew almost nothing about the Pacific theater of war, and for me it was all new things that I was discovering and reading about. And then again having this personal layer, when I really get the diaries and the letters of people, and I found many of them also in the London archives actually, especially from the army time. it was just fascinating world that kept me going, and I wanted to find more and build the bigger picture from all these little pieces of mosaic. And today, yeah, it's still interesting, you know, it's like, as I said, I'm trying to figure out what to do more. There is an idea to maybe organize a bit of small monument, you know, in Singapore for the Czechoslovaks who died. Yes. Yeah.
So, as you have mentioned before, Bata was really integrated in the Asian culture, right, in terms of shoes. And I had the same experience with my friends from Malaysia.
Mm-hmm.
They also told me that ever since they were young, they would go to shops to Bata for their shoes. And since Bata has been playing kind of significant role in the local economy, I was wondering if this has somehow affected the relationships maybe between Singapore and Czechoslovakia now or before.
I mean, it definitely had imprint, you know, in 1930s when Bata was bringing, you know, all these methods and company culture. And again, it's interesting because, for example, with this soccer club or these sport events, unlike with the British, you know, it was really intermixed with racial. You know, people of all sorts of races were playing in the same team. For example, there's like a list of names of the players in the soccer team, and you can tell, you know, there were Chinese and Mahais and Czechs, and it was okay. For the Brits, you know, it would never happen. So they were bringing some new traits or new elements to the colonial culture, no doubt. I think that at the moment the connection is really lost. One thing is that people don't realize it's Czechoslovak company. And that has been so far one of the more disappointing parts of the networking and research is that neither, you know, the Czech institutions are really interested. You know, I spoke and met with the ambassador, but you know, it's very superficial, no interest to really do anything. Although it's amazing, you know, you can actually connect and show that the Czechoslovaks, you know, were fighting for Singapore and its freedom, but there's like zero interest on the official lines. The Bata company also is not really keen to get, you know, all these historical things. I met the management in Singapore and it was very cold feet. You know, like they met us, but it was clear that, you know, they really are not keen on that. And I've heard that the only thing actually that is interesting, you know, to the Bata history is, you know, the family itself. So if it was someone from, you know, the family tree of Tomáš Bata, then they would be keen. But if it was this kind of no-name people who came, you know, before the war, yeah. No, I think there is no connection that would be functional now, unfortunately.
And that also got me wondering, so why do you think it is that the locals think that it's a local brand instead of Czechoslovakian brand?
Well, I think it's because it's very affordable. There was one of the models that Bata was, why he was so successful, because he was producing kind of high-end, you know, leather shoes for the rich clientele, but the mass production was really, you know, the super cheap rubber and cloth, you know, kind of the, I don't know what's the English term of the type of shoes. But he was producing like tens of millions of pairs of shoes just in this Malayan factory every year. And he was flooding the market and became very accessible, favorite, popular brand. And over time people, again, they don't think it's Czechoslovak, but they like it because it's their childhood and it's still, you know, relatively good quality for the price.
Was it in a way a conscious strategy to downplay the foreign goods?
I don't know. I didn't come across indication of the conscious, but it was kind of organic, right? Because the first wave or the first generation of managers were still Czechoslovaks, but you know the bulk of employees were locals. And then when the managers retired, you know, they basically promoted some of the local people, and then it really became even fully managed by the locals. That's what I know. Coincidentally, there was actually one of the many super interesting encounters, is that some of the Bata employees who survived the war, you know, because then Czechoslovak communists came and it was more difficult and they decided not to come back to Czechoslovakia, so some of them actually decided to stay. And one of them married a local woman and he's got a family. And I was able to trace him, and actually I've organized a meeting. It was really magic in Singapore. You know, after 80 years, someone approached them And I met actually still living life, a Chinese old lady Daisy of Silvestr's friend. And his two children were now retired, but they came and they brought family photos. And the son was actually remembering that his father was telling him about Silvestr, so those were really beautiful moments. It was not a direct hand or first hand, witnesses, because they are not there anymore. But at least, through the children there is still a little bit of connection that we made, and we are in touch, and it's very nice. It's one of these friendships or the connections I made that I'm really very happy about.
Well, you mentioned at several points in the book that had you started 10 years earlier or 20 years earlier, that there might have been of those witnesses still alive. On the other hand, some of the sources you have been so fruitfully using now would maybe not have been available. Could you reflect a little bit on what kind of book that would have been?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, sadly, if I was wise enough, I could have asked my grandmother, when she was still alive, and there definitely were people who actually were participants of these events, like in 1990s when I was already an adult, but to me it was nothing, it didn't mean much. And I came across, again, some archives of local historians who actually connected in 1990s with the families of people who actually were working and fighting. They were really the Czechoslovaks who have been involved in these events. And they had even some correspondence, which I now have also copies of. So there was possibilities to really speak to, direct witnesses and interview back then, which I missed. But on the other hand, I think I was actually in some ways lucky, because thanks to internet and the possibility to really connect and search and network virtually today, I managed to get probably even more information and or broader set of information than I would have been able to if I just had to speak to individual people face to face, and some of them would probably be out of reach, living in Australia. So it had its downsides, and I'm still a bit sorry, because it would have been nice. But I think that actually using the technologies of today that weren't there in 1990s helped me incredibly in making the connections and discovering things that otherwise I would have never chance to find myself.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. There's still one question there.
I have no question. I wanted to say about Tomáš Bata that after the war, about 40 years communism and 40 years communist historiography and papers, and they all did not say, did not write or lie about Zlín and about Tomáš Bata. And you have to, after communism, after the 90s, start write new history about Tomáš Bata and the company. And this is one of the reasons why there is no contact and we have so little information about the Czechoslovaks in Singapore. I did not hear about it and did not write until now, and I found very interesting your lecture. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
If there are no further questions, perhaps we can continue the conversation downstairs, or we can, of course, also in the back.
Yeah, there is actually books for people
Exactly, that's why we're here.
who don't have that. It's quite rare, I must say, because it's been published in Singapore and there is no distribution yet on continental Europe. So I actually brought physically a few dozen copies, and you can buy them on the back of the room if you still want the book and you haven't read it before. And I'm happy to sign, or we can also do a bit of mending downstairs, I think. There is some sweets that my wife and my daughter prepared, and maybe a couple of drinks. And we can continue the informal conversation down there.
Okay, then I want to thank everyone involved, especially Jan, and we will, like you said, continue downstairs.
But before we do it, I will ask exactly
everyone is invited on behalf of the Goethe Institute. Once again, really thank you very much, Claudia, for a drink downstairs in the cafeteria after you buy a book. And then we will continue in conversation. But first, I would like to thank both of the protagonists of tonight because it was really fascinating, and thank you very much for your thorough research, Jan.